after murdering his wife and 4 stepchildren. This ruthless stepfather calmly lived right on top of their bodies for an entire month, turning their sanctuary into an inescapable tomb. Right now, so many people out there still mistake suffocating control for love, trapping themselves in a violent cycle orchestrated by their own family. Today, we are opening the files to dissect the terrifying psychology of a family annihilator, helping you spot the monster hiding in plain sight before tragedy strikes. Family. For most of us, it is the ultimate sanctuary. It is the fortress where the storms of the outside world are supposed to stop right at the front door. But what happens when the monster isn't waiting outside in the dark? What happens when the monster is the one holding the keys, sleeping down the hall, or sitting at the head of the dinner table? Over my decade of analyzing the darkest corners of human psychology, I have seen horrors that would break the average mind. But nothing chills my blood quite like the family annihilator. Welcome back to the files. Today we are opening a case that will test everything you think you know about trust control and the monsters hiding in plain sight. We are traveling back to the autumn of 2000 to a quiet, foggy hamlet called Carnkie in Cornwall. No gunshots rang out in the night. No strangers broke through the windows. There was only a suffocating, terrifying silence that fell over a home that used to be filled with the laughter of 6 children. A mother and her 4 eldest kids simply vanished into thin air. The man left behind, Lee Ford, played the part of the abandoned, heartbroken husband to perfection. But when investigators finally dug into the soil of his backyard and cracked open the woodshed, they didn't just unearth 5 bodies. They unearthed a sprawling, sickening ecosystem of psychological warfare, domestic terror, and a taboo so dark it shatters every boundary of human decency. To understand this tragedy, we have to rewind the tape. Leslie Ford was a woman who simply loved being a mother. Growing up in Telford, she dreamed of a big, loud, happy house. Her first marriage to Michael Tranter gave her 4 beautiful children. They were, by all accounts, a picture-perfect family. But life is rarely perfect. The financial strain of raising 4 kids born so close together fractured the marriage, and they eventually divorced. Michael remained a loving father, completely devoted to his children. Then, in 1990, Lee Ford walked into Leslie's life. He wasn't the polished, steady man Michael was. Ford was a rough-around-the-edges laborer, clad in leather and denim, carrying an aura of gritty confidence. In the beginning, he played his role flawlessly. He showered Leslie with attention and accepted her 4 children. But listen to me carefully, because this is how the trap is always set. Psychological abusers do not start with a closed fist. They start with a love so intense it feels like a movie. We call it love bombing, and it is almost always followed by the second phase, isolation. Ford began planting seeds of jealousy. He despised Michael. Whenever Michael came to visit his own flesh and blood, Ford would throw up roadblocks. The kids aren't dressed. They haven't eaten. Come back later. He was systematically amputating Michael from his children's lives. Ford didn't want a family to love. He wanted an empire to rule, and those 4 kids were a daily reminder that Leslie had once belonged to someone else. Part 2. By 1995, the honeymoon phase was dead and buried. The emotional manipulation had mutated into physical violence. Leslie was trapped in a cycle of abuse, absorbing the blows to protect her children. But something inside her snapped. She found a window of courage, packed up all 6 of her children, the 4 with Michael and the 2 she shared with Ford, and fled to Cornwall. She left no forwarding address. She vanished into the countryside, making a desperate bid for survival. I need you to understand the sheer terror it takes for a mother of 6 to uproot her entire existence in the middle of the night. She wasn't just moving, She was running for her life. But the most fatal mistake anyone can make is underestimating the obsessive tenacity of a narcissist losing his grip on his possessions. Ford didn't let her go. He posed as a lawyer, manipulated Leslie's mother into giving up their location and tracked them down. He didn't show up with threats. He showed up with tears. He fell to his knees, swore he had found God, swore he had changed, and begged for his family back. And Leslie, exhausted, worn down by battered woman syndrome, and perhaps desperately wanting a father figure for her youngest kids, made the tragic decision to let him back in. It was a death sentence signed with misplaced forgiveness. Once the door was locked behind him in Cornwall, Ford's mask slipped off entirely and his grip tightened into a chokehold. He dictated what Leslie wore. He monitored her movements, but oddly, he completely detached himself from the family dynamic. Instead of playing the father, he retreated to the garage. He spent his days out there drinking heavily, using drugs, and stewing in a toxic brew of resentment and paranoia. He demanded to be the center of the universe, but Leslie, like any good mother, always put her children first. To a man with Ford's fragile, monstrous ego, being second place in his own house was a humiliation that demanded punishment. The atmosphere in the house became a pressure cooker. The kids walked on eggshells, their natural joy suffocated the moment Ford entered a room. But the emotional abuse and the physical beatings were only the surface. Deep in the shadows of that house, Ford was cultivating a secret so vile it defies comprehension. Part 3. Part 4. Late August, the year 2000. The tension in the house had reached a lethal boiling point. Leslie had finally reached her absolute limit. The physical beatings were one thing, but the destruction of her daughter was a line crossed in blood. She secretly sought legal counsel. She applied for a restraining order. She made contact with Michael again, opening the door for him to rescue his children. And most dangerously of all, she looked Lee Ford in the eye and told him she was leaving and that she was going to expose him for the monster he was. In criminal psychology, we call this the trigger point. For a narcissistic sociopath, the loss of control is terrifying, but the loss of public reputation, being exposed as a predator, is an ego death they cannot accept. If he couldn't own them, he would erase them. During a screaming match in their bedroom, Ford grabbed a wooden baseball bat. He beat Leslie mercilessly. But then he did something that proves exactly how cold-blooded he truly was. He stopped. He walked out of the bedroom, leaving her bleeding on the floor. He walked all the way out to his garage. He had minutes to cool down. He had time to walk away. Instead, he picked up a thick length of rope. He walked back into the house, stepped over to his wife, wrapped the rope around her neck, and choked the last breath out of her lungs. But the nightmare was just beginning. This was not a crime of passion. It was a calculated extermination. Ford gripped that rope and began stalking through the house. He walked up behind 17-year-old Sarah Jane and strangled her, then 16-year-old Anne-Marie, then 14-year-old Stephen, and finally 13-year-old Craig. He moved from room to room, executing the children he had raised for a decade. Forensic reports showed his method was brutally efficient. He had actually researched how to use a garrote on the internet. He didn't use a knife or a gun. He chose a method that required him to look them in the eye, to feel their life slip away in his hands. Think about the pure, unadulterated evil required to murder 4 children, one by one. Think of the terror they must have felt realizing the man who was supposed to protect them was their executioner. And the most chilling detail of all, he left his 2 biological children completely unharmed. This was a targeted surgical strike to eliminate Michael's legacy and protect his own dark secrets. Part 5. For over a month, Lee Ford lived in a graveyard of his own making. He dragged the 5 bodies into the backyard and buried them beneath the dirt of the woodshed. He went back to living his life. He returned the kids' books to their school, casually mentioning that Leslie had packed up and taken them back to Telford. He tried to cash Sarah Jane's final paycheck at McDonald's. He even called up an old girlfriend to ask her out on a date. He slept, ate, and watched television just feet away from the rotting corpses of his family. But the truth is a heavy thing, and it eventually rises to the surface. Leslie's brother, Peter, and her ex-husband, Michael, refused to buy the lies. They relentlessly pushed the police. As the investigation intensified, Ford felt the walls closing in. He grew paranoid, installing cheap security cameras around the property. He knew it was over. When the police finally moved in to arrest him in early October, Ford was actually in the process of digging up the bodies to move them to a farmer's field. He was caught red-handed. In the interrogation room, the facade finally cracked. He confessed to the murders and drew a map to the bodies. But when it came time for trial, Ford initially pleaded not guilty, playing games with the justice system. It wasn't until the very last moment, facing the reality that all of his filthy secrets and his abuse of Sarah Jane would be broadcast to the world, that he changed his plea to guilty. He accepted 5 life sentences to avoid the shame of a public trial. To this day, he has never offered a real explanation, never shed a tear of genuine remorse. He sits in a concrete box, a pathetic king of a ruined empire. The devastation he left behind is immeasurable. Michael Tranter has to live the rest of his life with the agonizing knowledge that his 4 children were stolen from him in the dark. But as we close this file, we cannot just walk away in silence. We have to take the lesson written in their blood. Control is not love. Jealousy is not affection. Isolation is not safety. When someone tells you who you can talk to, what you can wear, and uses their fists to win arguments, they are not protecting you. They are imprisoning you. If you are in a situation where the walls are closing in, I am begging you to make the hardest choice of your life. Leave in silence, leave in safety, and never ever believe that your love can cure a monster. Until next time, keep your eyes open and trust your instincts. The truth is out there, but sometimes you have to dig through the darkness to find it. By the time 1995 rolled around, the illusion of the happy blended family was dead and buried. The emotional manipulation that Lee Ford had so carefully seeded in the early days of their relationship had fully mutated into explosive physical violence. Leslie Ford was trapped in a relentless, terrifying cycle of abuse. She was constantly absorbing the blows, both physical and psychological, in a desperate attempt to act as a human shield for her children. But the human spirit can only endure so much before the instinct for survival takes over. Something inside Leslie finally snapped. She found a fleeting window of courage, a brief moment where the fear of staying finally outweighed the fear of leaving. In the dead of night, she packed up all 6 of her children, the 4 she shared with Michael and the 2 toddlers she had with Ford, and she fled to Cornwall. She left no forwarding address. She cut ties with her immediate social circle. She vanished into the English countryside, making a desperate bid for freedom. I need you to pause and really understand the sheer terror it takes for a mother of 6 to uproot her entire existence like that. She wasn't just moving to a new town for a fresh start. She was running for her life. This is a textbook response for a victim of extreme domestic terror. When you are dealing with a violent controller, you don't file for divorce through regular channels. You don't have a calm conversation about dividing assets. You run and you hide because you know that leaving is the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship. Statistics show that a woman's risk of being murdered by her abuser increases exponentially in the weeks after she tries to leave. Leslie knew this in her gut. She was trying to become a ghost to save her children. But the most fatal mistake anyone can make is underestimating the obsessive predatory tenacity of a narcissist who feels he is losing his grip on his possessions. And that is exactly how Lee Ford viewed his family as property. When an abuser's victim escapes, the abuser doesn't feel heartbreak or sadness. They feel a narcissistic rage. They feel that something they own has been stolen from them. Ford didn't let her go. He didn't respect her boundaries. Instead, he went on the hunt. He knew Leslie was too smart to leave a paper trail, so he targeted the weakest link in her armor, her family back home. Ford actually posed as a solicitor, a legal professional, and contacted Leslie's mother. Using legal jargon and fake concerns about the welfare of the children, he manipulated the terrified grandmother into giving up Leslie's secret location in Cornwall. It was a calculated, chillingly cold piece of deception. Once he had the address, he didn't show up kicking down the door with his fists raised. That's not how the cycle of abuse works. He showed up with tears streaming down his face. He fell to his knees. He swore to her that the separation had broken him, that he had hit rock bottom, that he had found God, and that he was an entirely changed man. He begged for his family back. He played the role of the broken, repentant husband so perfectly that it would have won him an Oscar, and Leslie took him back. To the outside observer, to people who have never lived under the shadow of a fist, this decision seems incomprehensible. Why would she open the door to the monster she just risked everything to escape? But as an investigator, I see this all the time. It is a psychological phenomenon known as trauma bonding, often intertwined with battered woman syndrome. When you are abused by someone, and that same person occasionally shows you extreme kindness or begs for your forgiveness, your brain becomes addicted to the cycle. You mistake the absence of violence for love. Furthermore, Leslie was exhausted. She was alone in a strange place with 6 mouths to feed. The sheer logistical nightmare of single motherhood combined with the psychological warfare Ford was waging simply wore her down. She wanted desperately to believe that the father of her youngest children could be a good man. It was a tragic decision born of exhaustion and misplaced hope. It was a death sentence signed with forgiveness. The moment the door locked behind him in that house in Carnkie, Cornwall, the tears dried up. The repentant husband vanished instantly. Ford's mask didn't just slip off. He ripped it off and threw it away, because now he had them isolated. They were hundreds of miles away from Michael, away from Leslie's brother Peter, away from anyone who could hear them scream. His grip tightened into a suffocating chokehold. He began to dictate every aspect of Leslie's existence. He chose what clothes she was allowed to wear, ensuring she looked plain and unattractive to other men. He monitored her every movement. He controlled the finances down to the last penny. This is what we call coercive control. It is an invisible prison where the bars are made of fear and intimidation. But here is where Ford's psychology takes a fascinating, albeit repulsive, turn. Even though he fought so ruthlessly to get his family back once he had them, he completely detached himself from the family dynamic. He didn't play the role of the loving father he promised to be. Instead, he retreated. He claimed the garage as his personal sanctuary. He spent his days and nights out there, isolating himself from the noise and needs of the children. He drank heavily. He used drugs. He sat in the dark, stewing in a toxic, bubbling brew of resentment and paranoia. Why would a man who moved mountains to reclaim his family suddenly ignore them? Because for Lee Ford, it was never about love. It was about winning. He wanted to be the absolute center of Leslie's universe. He demanded unwavering, undivided worship. But Leslie, like any good mother, always put the needs of her 6 children first. If a child was crying, she went to the child, not to Ford. To a man with a fragile, monstrous ego, being placed second in his own house was an intolerable humiliation. He resented the children for taking Leslie's attention away from him. So he punished her with his sullen withdrawal, forcing her to constantly try to appease him while walking on eggshells. The atmosphere in that rural cottage became a pressure cooker. The air was thick with unspoken threats. The children learned to be invisible. Their natural joy and boisterousness suffocated the exact second they heard his heavy boots